My name is Joseph Contreras, and I'm in 5th grade at Cesar Chavez Leadership Academy, and I was wondering what type of challenges did you face growing up?
I was born in New York City on October 27, 1858. My father was a relatively wealthy man. We came from middling stock in New York City. I was a fragile child. I had childhood asthma and some other maladies, and I couldn't go to school. I had to be privately tutored because of that. And it wasn't even clear that I would live to be an adult. And it wasn't until I was 12 that my father came to me and said, "Theodore, your mind is strong, but your body is weak. You must make your body." And I decided I would make my body, and by sheer willpower alone, I went on to become something of a strenuous adult. And I lived a good and long life of great adventure.
My name is Sophia. I am in 6th grade at Cesar Chavez Leadership Academy. What is some advice you would give to students facing problems?
I'd say there's nothing you can't overcome. If I could overcome my own difficulties, and they were very severe, then anybody can overcome their difficulties. It takes a great deal of discipline and willpower and drive and encouragement from others, but you can do it. You must never regard yourself as less or incapacitated in any way or special. You must just rise to the occasion, and if you really try to do it, you will find your niche. Maybe it's in the arts, maybe it's in literature, maybe it's being a great student, maybe it's being an athlete, but there's something you can do better than almost anybody else, and you must try.
Hi, my name is Serenity. I go to Cesar Chavez Elementary School, and I was wondering, how important is the study of government as we try to conserve our democracy?
Well, we must understand why the United States is different from other nations. So it's important that every student know the Declaration of Independence, which was Jefferson's greatest achievement, and the Bill of Rights, which was Madison's greatest achievement. And every young person should read the Federalist Papers and know how a bill is passed into law and know how separation of powers work and be able to not only enumerate the Bill of Rights, but to talk about each one and what liberties and rights they protect. Well, these are essential things, but I think that is something that should be in every school system in the country, and every high school graduate should be able to answer questions about these fundaments of American democracy. But beyond that, I must say, I think that education's primary role is character building. Knowing facts about the Civil War or knowing the causes of World War I are important, but what we must really do is build character. Character will always outdistance learning. Learning's important, but it must take a subordinate role to fundamental values and character. And those come partly from schools, partly from our churches if we have them, but primarily from our own families. And a boy without character is going to be a very bad man, I think.
Have your views on immigration changed from 1901 to 2016?
I think there were the same issues in my time. There were people who wanted to close down the immigration system and to keep undesirables out of the country. And at the time it was more the Irish and the people from Yugoslavia and Italy that they were concerned about, people from Eastern Europe. But there was a lot of nativism here and a lot of anxiety about the streams of immigrants coming to this nation, because it wasn't clear that they would speak English, that they would know the same customs of the Magna Carta and the British Bill of Rights and our own Declaration of Independence. So we had to find a way to absorb these people. And at first I was rather stern about that. But when I got to know the immigrants in New York City living in these terrible tenements and selling their labor for just pennies on the hour, I became their friend, and I realized that they would have to get some help from the government of the United States to protect their basic rights, and that in some sense we must create a safety net for the newest of our people and help them get a leg up to become good American citizens like the rest of us. But you can't just expect that to happen. It does take human agency to bring people into this country, and they almost all wind up being great Americans in the end. But I will say this, I do not like hyphenated Americans. If you're Irish American, then you must become an American. If you're South African American, then you must give up your customs and your background from South Africa and become a true American citizen. Hyphenated Americans, whether they're German Americans or Irish Americans, or for that matter, American Indians, I do not respect. I want every American to become a full-blooded American citizen.
The Roosevelt School District is named after you. What is so important about the education of kids?
Well, I love to read, and I would urge everyone who's watching this to read as many books as you possibly can. You know, I often read a book a day through my entire life. I had one of the largest libraries of any president. I wrote 35 books. I'm the writingest president in American history. I think the second writingest president up till my time was John Quincy Adams, who wrote 12 books. I wrote 35, and some of them are regarded as American classics. So education really mattered to me. You can see the names of books scattered through my correspondence and my public speeches, and there were books that changed the very way I saw life. Books can never be overestimated for the power they have to lift somebody out of the local circumstances, to see a larger world, to dream bigger and more broadly, to have a good sense of creative fancy and so on. So when I was a child, I couldn't go to school. I read adventure books, dime novels about the American West, and novels by a man named Mayne Reid, novels like The Buffalo Hunter and so on. And they gave me a spirit of adventure that eventually brought me to the West, to what's now North Dakota. But I also went to Colorado to hunt grizzly bears and mountain lions, and I hunted in Texas, and I hunted in Washington State. I hunted all over the country and saw the great features of the landscape like Yellowstone and Yosemite and your own Grand Canyon, which I visited in May of 1903.
You showed great passion for the environment as president. Did you make the changes you had hoped?
Well, I would have done more if I had been able to do more. I set aside 230 million acres of the public domain as national park, national forest, national wildlife refuge, national game preserve, etc., national monument. And I would have done much more if I'd been able to, but Congress was not with me on this. Congress was still wanting to cooperate with the great timber industries and the water industry and the cattle industry and so on, the mining industries. And so I had very little cooperation from Congress. I did almost all of this by executive order or presidential proclamation. So I'm proud of what I did. I think it set the tone for conservation in the rest of American history, but I think it's fair to say that no president in your entire history has done as much for conservation as I did, including a great deal here in the state of Arizona.
Roosevelt Dam here in Arizona was named after you. What was it like attending the opening ceremony?
Roosevelt Dam was a great monument to my life and my work. Statues are a monument, the libraries are a monument, but somehow this was Rooseveltian. It was at the time, Roosevelt Dam, the largest cyclopean dam in the world. So it was a monumental structure. And it was really a monument to what humans can do with the help of the federal government. I doubt that the people of Arizona would have been able to do this on their own, but thanks to the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and the Reclamation Act of 1902, we were able to get them the money they needed to produce this great thing, with some local monies involved too, of course. And I was here to dedicate it, and it was one of the proudest days of my life. And I went by way of that very dangerous Apache Trail, which I loved. That was one of the great experiences of my life. And then I was able to throw the switch at Roosevelt Dam. And this was after my presidency. I gave a little speech. It was one of the happiest days of my entire life.
What do you think Americans should be doing to conserve democracy?
I think that I would say what I said in my own time, that we must be strenuous. Every American needs to be fit. It bothers me to learn that in your time, 1/3 of your children are obese. There's no excuse for that. We have abundance in our food supply. We have access to the greatest luxuries that humans have ever known, but we must remain a healthy people. Sedentary, overweight people cannot compete in the world's arena, certainly cannot compete for very long. And so I think we need a new commitment to strenuous exercise, to fitness, to health, to hiking, outdoor vigor, camping, doing whatever it takes for us to become a strong people again. But once you lose your edge, then you begin to compromise in the world's arena because you would rather negotiate than fight. Sometimes it's necessary to fight. We wish it were otherwise, but there are evil nations, and there are evil dictators, and there are evil doers in this world. And the United States is going to have to stand up for the values that it espouses from time to time. And every time you get a little more sedentary and a little more comfortable, a little more overweight, a little more lazy, then your tendency is to try to negotiate your differences rather than stand up for yourself. And I know it's no longer fashionable, but I think a war from time to time has a kind of cathartic, cleansing effect on the body politic. And I would only fight a just war, of course, but there are plenty of just wars to fight. And it seems to me that that's what made this country great, is the spirit of Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett and George Rogers Clark, or for that matter, George Washington. I hope that we never fully lose that.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the creation of the Midnight Forest?
This was the last great act of conservation that I was able to do. By the time of my second term, there was some, I think, Roosevelt fatigue in the Congress. I had been so energetic and had come on like a freight train or a series of freight trains, and they were getting a little tired of this. And under the Timber Act, I was able to set aside national forests, and I had been doing a great deal of it. In the course of my administration, I set aside 150 million acres of national forest, quite a bit of it, by the way, here in Arizona, plus national monuments in Arizona. But some of the timber interests got to some senators from the Northwest, particularly one Charles Fulton of Oregon, and said, Roosevelt is a menace, he's locking up the West, he's making it impossible for us to profit, can't you stop him? And so Fulton, who was wholly in bed with these terrible timber barons, put a rider on a routine appropriation bill that said no new national forests in 6 northwestern states, one of which was Oregon. That would have put me in a straitjacket, but I had to sign that bill because it was a rider on an essential appropriations bill, and if I didn't sign that bill, the government of the United States would have had to shut down. And so I was between a rock and a hard place. I did not want to give up this power that had been granted by a previous Congress to the president to design forests, to set aside forest reserves. And so I got my U.S. Forester, Gifford Pinchot, a close friend of mine, in, and I said, we have 10 days between the moment I get this law and when I have to sign it, which I must. But during those 10 days, we can designate some more forests, and we did. And these became known as the Midnight Forests. I think there were more than 12 million acres of them around the country, and some of it in those 6 northwestern states. And in fact, in Oregon, I added some acreage just to make this Charles Fulton unhappy. And my goodness, he was unhappy, but I had a presidential right to do so up until the day that I signed that bill, and I made the most of it. If I hadn't had to sign that bill, I would have done more before I left office in March of 1909.
You increased the role of federal government into everyday life. Did your policies work the way you wanted?
When I was President of the United States between September 14th, 1901 and March 4th, 1909, the Congress wasn't doing much. They didn't have much gumption or creativity, and so the country was beginning to lag behind. And I don't think they realized that the country had changed, that we weren't Jefferson's nation anymore, or even Andrew Jackson's, that after the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution had come, and big banks and monopolies and so on, the railroads. And so now it was important that there be some way to sort all of this out and to make sure that the little man, the immigrant or the average citizen living in a village like Prescott or Wadena, Minnesota for that matter, had an ally. If you just look at Standard Oil, they're not going to take care of the average American. They're going to exploit the earth and exploit simple people. And so who's going to look out for them? Labor unions do some of it, and I'm for them up to a point. But I think the government of the United States is the only entity strong enough to be a counterbalance to the great meat packers or to the railroad trusts or to Carnegie's U.S. Steel or J.P. Morgan's banks. And so government inevitably takes on this role. It's not a role that I would wish for it, but if the government did not do it, who would? And so we must, I think, reluctantly realize that in the age of industrial gigantism and the urbanization of American life, that government plays that role because it's the only entity with the strength and the creativity to do so. It must do so responsibly. We need a very good and able civil service of honest government bureaucrats, but government's role, I think, is essential, and anyone who believes that's not the case, I don't think has looked into it.
How has the process of running a campaign changed from when you ran till now?
Finance was important in campaigns in my time too, and when I stood for election in my own right in 1904, we took campaign contributions from a large number of Wall Street firms and great corporations. It became somewhat controversial because I was a trust buster and I was attacking what I called malefactors of great wealth and unusual combinations of monopoly and trust. And so I was publicly a trust buster, but I also needed that money in order to run an effective campaign. So this always puts a person in a bind. I would hope that we could limit the campaign contributions. I certainly think they should be made public so that the public knows that when they voted for me or for William Howard Taft or Woodrow Wilson, the money for those campaigns came from such and such entities. And then if I were president and I had to adjudicate an issue involving that railroad or that steel trust, at least the public would know when there's a conflict of interest. So I think transparency may be more important than the actual control of the money.
Social media plays a big role in everyday life. What do you think about it?
I would have been great at social media because I like to say strong, sometimes pugnacious things, to speak very boldly. You know, take some of my statements. Speak softly but carry a big stick. I think that fits in Twitter. I think I could have conformed to that thing. I tried not to use two words where one would serve. I'm not a long-winded sort of man. So I think I might have been able to do it. But I think that more importantly, these social media technologies give you access to the American people, and it gives the American people access to government. So that you have ways of speaking to each other that simply didn't exist in my time. You know, there were very few photographs in our newspapers in my time. There was no television. There certainly were no computers. There was radio towards the end of my life, but it really was still kind of a gimmick and a novelty. I would have given anything to be able to speak to the American people on radio or on television, or more in your era, to speak instantaneously on questions of importance to the future of this country. So you have the technologies to make this a true democracy, to really to create a dynamic interplay between the constituents and their government, and to allow people to follow the workings of government and to try to persuade their representatives to do the right thing. I would have been so joyful to have those methods of communication in my time. We just didn't. So I would try to master whatever was put in front of me and use it for the good of the people, to make sure that everyone gets a square deal and that every American understands what a glory it is to be a citizen of this, the greatest of all republics in the world.